It was well past midnight when the heavy knock sounded on the door of our Baker Street lodgings. I had just set down the medical journal I'd been thumbing through and was beginning to drift into a light sleep when Holmes, still fully dressed in his armchair and blowing thin rings of smoke from his pipe, stirred like a cat who had expected the sound all along. "You will find our visitor's shoes are damp with the dew of the Westbourne Gardens," he said as I rose to answer. I opened the door to reveal a man of about 50, tall and broad-shouldered, his manner anxious, and his overcoat dusted with faint droplets of London fog. He held his bowler hat in a trembling hand, and seemed to eye Holmes with the uncertainty of one who feared mockery as much as disbelief. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, voice low and tight. Holmes inclined his head without rising. "And you, sir, are burdened by a matter that has resisted both explanation and peace of mind. Please sit. You have come from Kensington on foot?" The stranger blinked. Yes, I have. But how did you—" "Your collar is turned to protect against a west wind. The moisture upon your cuffs is not from rain, but low-set foliage. A man who walks through Holland Park at night does not do so idly." The man gave a short, humorless chuckle, sank into the armchair opposite, and introduced himself. "My name is Edgar Cranley. I'm a solicitor by profession with an office in Lincoln's Inn. What brings me here tonight is, well, a matter I can hardly put into words without fearing for my sanity." "Do try," said Holmes, steepling his fingers. "Those who fear madness are often nearest to reason." Mr. Cranley leaned forward. "It concerns a man who was buried 4 days ago. A guest who stayed at my home, dined at my table, and, until this morning, was most certainly dead." I glanced at Holmes, expecting one of his wry remarks, but his expression remained utterly still. "You believe this man is alive?" he asked. "I saw him with my own eyes, Mr. Holmes," Cranley said gravely. "At the corner of Mortimer Street this morning. He passed by me in full daylight. He even wore the same checked cravat I recall from our last conversation." "Did he speak?" "No, he kept walking, but I am convinced it was him." Holmes lit a fresh match and leaned forward to reignite his pipe. "Begin at the beginning. Who was this guest?" Cranley took a steadying breath. "His name was Gilbert Fry, a client of mine, though only briefly. He arrived at my home some 2 weeks ago, quite unannounced. Said he was in personal difficulty and needed a discreet place to remain for a few nights. My wife had met him once before in connection with a family estate dispute, and so, reluctantly, I agreed." "What sort of man was he?" I asked. "Charming. Articulate, but evasive. He claimed to have enemies in the city and seemed nervous whenever letters arrived. He never stayed in the same room 2 nights running and often changed his appearance. Beard, spectacles, hats. I began to suspect he was hiding something. Did he explain his death?" Holmes asked calmly, as if querying the state of the weather. Cranley gave a bitter laugh. "No. One morning I was told by the police that a body had been found in the canal near Little Venice. The identification was confirmed by the contents of his wallet and a peculiar signet ring he always wore. The cause of death was ruled suicide. We arranged a modest burial. And yet this morning the same man walked past you?" "Exactly so." Holmes stood, walked to the window and parted the curtains to stare out into the street below. "And you told no one? No one but you?" "My wife is abroad visiting her sister, and I've no wish to be seen as delusional by my colleagues." "Quite so," Holmes murmured. "Watson, what do you make of this tale?" I was reluctant to commit myself, though my mind leaned toward the rationale. A mistaken identity, perhaps. A man who resembles Mr. Fry. That was my initial thought, Cranley admitted, but this man bore an identical scar above the brow. Something Frey had shown me one night over brandy, claiming it was from a duel in the Americas. The chances of another man with the same scar and ring are precisely what make the improbable probable," Holmes interrupted, turning back from the window. "Mr. Cranley, do you still possess any of Mr. Fry's effects?" "A few letters, a small box of personal items he left behind. I brought them with me." He placed a leather satchel on the table, from which Holmes extracted a packet of correspondence and a folded note, which he sniffed, then held to the lamp. Cheap ink. West African manufacture. Interesting. Watson, what do you see? I examined the handwriting. It was tightly looped, with flourishes uncommon in English styles. Foreign influence, I offered. Holmes nodded. Possibly forged. But not recently. The paper has yellowed and bears creases consistent with prolonged storage. This was not composed in haste. He turned next to the box, a small polished wooden case with brass corners. Inside were mundane items, a comb, a railway ticket from a week prior, and a tiny fragment of torn fabric red with a black border. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A mourning ribbon. He snapped the case shut. Mr. Cranley, he said, this is no mere ghost story. The man you saw this morning was meant to be dead, which means either someone misidentified the body or someone intended it to be misidentified. Both are avenues worth exploring. Cranley stood, visibly relieved. Then you will take the case? I already have, Holmes replied. But first, Watson, we must pay a visit to the mortuary records office and obtain the details of Mr. Frey's post-mortem. There's something rather strange about a man who dies by suicide, only to reappear with his cravat neatly knotted. As the clock struck 2 and Mr. Cranley took his leave, I could not help but feel the first tremors of a case that would, in time, test both logic and belief. Holmes remained at the window, pipe in hand, eyes narrowed at the fog curling along Baker Street. This guest, he muttered, almost to himself, either never died or died twice. The following morning found us trudging through the grimy fog that clung stubbornly to the cobblestones of Clerkenwell, the morning mists of London unwilling to yield even to the indifferent light of the new day. The mortuary records office, wedged between a grocer's and a tobacco shop, bore the hallmarks of its purpose, quiet, worn, and indifferent to the living. The clerk with rimless spectacles and fingers stained with ink greeted us without ceremony. We're here for the post-mortem record of a man found in the canal. Gilbert Frey, Holmes announced, drawing out a calling card. Mr. Edgar Cranley has sanctioned the inquiry. The clerk shuffled through a bound volume, his tongue twitching between his lips like a lizard's, then nodded. Yes, sir. Drowned male, identified as Mr. Frey. Pulled from the water 5 days ago. Entries here. You may read, but not remove. Holmes hunched over the ledger while I peered around at the austere room. Rows of dark filing cabinets, the lingering scent of formaldehyde, and a window crusted with the soot of decades. Holmes flipped pages with an exacting touch, his brow furrowed and muttered now and then, almost inaudibly. There's something here, Watson, he said suddenly. Note the examiner's summary. Subject bore signs of immersion for no more than 4 hours. Death likely caused by asphyxiation. No significant external wounds. Ring and wallet intact. Identified by solicitor Edgar Cranley. Burial permitted. Yes? I asked, puzzled. Holmes tapped his forefinger on a line near the bottom. No autopsy performed. Death presumed consistent with suicide by drowning. Curious, isn't it, that no full examination was deemed necessary? Perhaps the evidence was sufficient. Perhaps, he said, unconvinced, or perhaps someone wished to ensure that evidence was not uncovered. He requested to view the mortuary log, an index of personal effects retained after recovery. The clerk obliged, presenting us with a small side drawer containing a pair of soggy, now-dried boots, a crushed cigar case, and a torn scrap of paper, its ink smeared but legible in parts. Holmes held the scrap to the light. A fragment of a letter, it seems, he mused. Your silence ensures our... And here, the rest is gone. But look at the seal. He pointed to a faint wax remnant still clinging to the edge. Black wax, with what seems to be the imprint of an acacia blossom. Not common, I was about to ask the significance, when Holmes snapped the drawer shut and turned toward the door. We have what we need for now. Next, Watson, we must examine the grave. You mean to exhume the body? I asked, startled. Not unless absolutely necessary. But a visit to the cemetery may yield more than we expect. You forget, corpses do not always remain where they are placed. It was close to noon by the time we reached Paddington Old Cemetery, the iron gates creaking in solemn welcome. A sharp breeze rustled the withered ivy clinging to headstones, and the morning mist had settled into a low, clinging damp that rendered the graveyard unnervingly quiet. Holmes walked with measured steps, his cane tapping lightly as we followed the gravel path to the section marked for recent burials. We found the grave easily. Gilbert Frey, etched in modest lettering on a dark granite marker, the soil above still fresh and unplanted. A narrow border of wilting chrysanthemums had been laid, perhaps by Cranley himself. Holmes knelt, removed his gloves, and pressed his palm to the earth. Still soft. The rain has done little to settle it, no evidence of disturbance, yet he rose and looked around. Watson, observe the headstone. Rather fine craftsmanship for a man with no family. Cranley claimed Frey was merely a client, yet this stone is not only polished granite but custom-carved, I had to agree. The inscription was elegant, precise. Could be simple decency, I offered. A gesture of conscience. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he drew a small magnifying lens from his coat and examined the lower edge of the stone. There, he murmured. A chip. Small, fresh, as though a metal tool slipped while the name was being engraved. He produced a notebook and jotted a few observations before stepping back. This grave, Watson, is too new, too precise, and too unexamined. I suspect it was meant more for the living than the dead. We returned to Baker Street for a late luncheon, Mrs. Hudson serving cold meats and a tart cranberry jelly that Holmes ignored entirely, preferring instead to pace the rug in a series of rapid, irregular circles. He stopped only to retrieve the wooden box Mr. Cranley had left behind the night prior. "Let us revisit the contents," he said, reopening the lid. Inside, beyond the mourning ribbon and comb, was the railway ticket Holmes had mentioned. He studied it now, more carefully. "Dated 4 days before the supposed death," he said, "from Stratford-upon-Avon to Marylebone. Single fare. That suggests either he had no plans to return, or knew he wouldn't." He turned next to the mourning ribbon. "Look at the thread count. This is not factory-dyed, but hand-dyed silk, and this red isn't mourning red. It's the shade used in certain ceremonial societies." "You mean Freemasons?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Darker than that. There are lesser-known circles, esoteric clubs, some formed in the wake of the war, that mix spiritualism, secret rites, and old familial blood oath. I fear we are wandering into territory less rational than I prefer." I raised an eyebrow. "And yet it has you intrigued." He gave a thin smile. "More than I care to admit." Before I could reply, there came a sudden rap at the door, sharp, quick, and hurried. Mrs. Hudson showed in a young constable from Scotland Yard. He looked about 20, with copper-colored hair and the nervous energy of one unused to Baker Street's singular atmosphere. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but Inspector Lestrade said you might wish to know. A body's turned up in Lambeth under curious circumstances." Holmes tilted his head. "Curious in what way?" The constable hesitated. "Strangled, sir. But with a red silk ribbon tied tight around the neck. And the victim was, well, he was wearing a checked cravat. Just like the one described on your notice this morning." I stood quickly. "Gilbert Frey?" "We haven't confirmed his identity," the constable replied. "But from the looks of it, it may well be your guest who died." "Again." Holmes reached for his coat. "Then it seems the guest who died twice may in fact have died a third time. Come, Watson. The game, it seems, has re-entered its second act. Lambeth, at the hour we arrived, was buried under a greasy pall of fog thick enough to turn gas lamps into smudges and passers-by into phantoms. The alleys and lanes near the railway siding seemed carved out of old coal smoke, and the quiet was broken only by the distant hoot of a steam whistle and the shuffle of restless feet. The constable led us down an alley off Belvoir Street, where a small crowd had gathered near the back entrance of a boarding house. 2 more officers stood watch, shoulders squared and arms folded, their expressions taut with something I could only interpret as unease. Holmes surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes, moving like a man who had already solved 3/4 of the puzzle and merely awaited the last thread to fall into place. A white-sheeted figure lay on a stretcher beside the wall, its edges weighted with brick fragments to keep the wind from lifting it. Holmes crouched beside the form, motioning for the sheet to be drawn back. I joined him silently. The face revealed was pale, the lips tinged with violet, and the eyelids slightly puffed. Around the throat was a distinct ligature mark, raw and narrow, beneath which a red silk ribbon remained loosely tied in a rough knot, the ends trailing down like ceremonial sashes. It was grotesquely elegant. "Is this the same ribbon?" I murmured. Holmes leaned closer, running a gloved finger along the weave. "Same silk. Same dye. But note the difference, Watson. This one bears a small stitch at the knot's base. Someone intended it to remain fixed. Symbolic, perhaps, or merely functional." He pulled the cravat aside, a grey and green check just as Mr. Cranley had described. Holmes rose and turned to the constable. "Who found him?" "One of the boarding-house maids, sir," the young man said. "She was dumping coal ash in the alley when she saw his boots sticking out behind the bins. No one in the house recognized him. Said he wasn't staying there. Time of death?" The constable flipped through a small notebook. "Dr. Parnell estimated it within 3 hours of discovery. That would place it shortly before dawn." Holmes turned to me. "Then the man must have been killed elsewhere and deposited here under the cover of fog. We are no longer investigating a suicide, Watson. We are facing a murder calculated to mimic the impossibility of a resurrection." I crouched once more to inspect the face. "There's no visible struggle, no bruises, no signs of resistance." "Because he knew the person who killed him," Holmes replied. "Or more likely, he trusted them. The knot isn't just meant to kill, it's meant to silence." The arrival of Inspector Lestrade broke the cold rhythm of our thoughts. He emerged from the fog with his usual energy and a tone that suggested both irritation and curiosity. "Well, Holmes, I suppose you've already deduced who he was, who killed him, and why." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not quite. But I am certain of one thing. This man died because someone believed he had died already. And that, Inspector, is a rare motive." Lestrade's eyebrows shot up. "You mean this is our canal man?" "That is yet to be confirmed. Watson, check the inner pocket I did so carefully, and pulled free a folded telegram, damp but legible. Addressed to Gilbert Fry," I read aloud. "Sent yesterday. It says only, 'Final arrangements confirmed.' Dockside, 1 o'clock. "Which dockside?" Lestrade asked. "There's no return address," I replied, "but the postmark is Poplar." Holmes took the slip and examined it under the dull gaslight. "Then our next stop is eastward. But first, we must address the question that everyone else will avoid." "And what's that?" Lestrade asked. "Whether the man buried under Frey's name was ever Gilbert Frey to begin with." Lestrade blinked. "You think the wrong man was buried?" Holmes turned slowly, gesturing toward the corpse. "Or the wrong man is dead. We must now entertain the possibility that there were 2 men, perhaps accomplices, perhaps enemies, both tied to the identity of Gilbert Fry. One is buried, one is murdered. But which one was the guest at Cranley's home?" Lestrade blew out a low whistle and muttered something about ghosts in bowler hats. We left the alley soon after, but not before Holmes requested the body be moved discreetly and examined again by a different medical officer. Someone without a reputation for tidy conclusions, as he put it. By mid-afternoon, we were rattling toward Poplar aboard a hackney cab, the fog having lifted slightly to reveal a sky the color of soot and tarnished pewter. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet for much of the journey, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. "The telegram," he said suddenly, "was not a warning. It was an invitation. The victim arrived believing something would begin, and instead It ended. Dockside could mean smuggling, I offered. Frey's past was murky. He changed rooms nightly, feared letters, spoke of enemies. True, Holmes said. And yet I suspect this is not a criminal affair in the ordinary sense. There is an artistry to the deception, a performance. Do you believe Frey was his real name? Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. No, I believe it was a borrowed name, and perhaps even lent more than once. The poplar docks were half slumbering when we arrived, wooden crates stacked like forgotten dreams, gulls wheeling above, and dock hands slouching by ropes and barrels. A few steamers waited in the mist, their engines panting in quiet threat. Holmes presented the telegram to a harbor master with shoulders like barrels and a voice like coarse sandpaper. Final arrangements confirmed. I know the words. That's not shipping talk. That's the Vanitas Club. Holmes lifted an eyebrow. Vanitas? Private gentlemen's group. Operate out of a warehouse up toward the fish market. Paintings, auctions, odd gatherings. Never clear on what they do exactly. Do they meet often? Once a month, sometimes less. Always after dark. Quiet lot. Fancy types. One of them wears gloves like a bishop. Holmes thanked him and turned to me. I believe our puzzle has a stage, Watson. And now it requires an audience. As we walked back toward the street, he added thoughtfully, we must tread carefully. Any place named after a still life of death is unlikely to appreciate uninvited guests. Before I could respond, Holmes paused, eyes fixed on a figure darting between two buildings across the quay. A man in a long coat and hat, watching us with too much interest. But before we could give chase, he vanished into the smoke. Was it Frey? I asked, breath catching. Holmes shook his head slowly. It was someone who knows who Frey was. And that may be more valuable still. It was 6:30 by the time we reached the fish market district of Poplar. The scent of salt, brine, and something more pungently decaying clung to the air, even as the sky dimmed into a grainy twilight. The cobblestones here were slick with oil and rain, and the warehouses loomed like silent monoliths, the shuttered windows and thick doors offering no welcome. But Holmes, walking as if on hallowed ground, scanned the buildings with keen precision. We stopped before a wide, slate-colored structure with no signage save a faded number painted above the entrance. 27B. A single iron lantern burned beside the door, casting long shadows across the street. From within came the faintest strains of music, harpsichord, or perhaps a phonograph recording meant to sound like one. Holmes tapped 3 times against the wood with his knuckle. When there was no response, he withdrew a folded piece of card from his breast pocket and slipped it through the narrow gap between the doors. "You carried an invitation?" I asked, astonished. "No," Holmes said calmly, "but I carried what passes for one. It's a replica of a previous year's Vanitas Club card, lifted from an estate auction catalogue 2 years ago. The original bore a black wax seal with an acacia blossom. Sound familiar?" The door creaked inward after a pause, opened by a man whose face might have been sculpted from candle wax, expressionless, smooth, and pale. He wore a black dinner coat and thin grey gloves. His eyes lingered on Holmes, then me, and without a word, he motioned for us to enter. We stepped into a vestibule cloaked in velvet curtains, dimly lit by amber sconces. The air was perfumed, heady with something floral and faintly medicinal. Another attendant, this one older and with an arched spine, approached with a tray bearing 2 slim black masks. "Guests are asked to observe discretion," he said with a clipped tone. Holmes took the mask and slipped it over his face without hesitation. I followed suit, though with some reluctance. Beyond the curtains lay a room unlike any I'd entered. High ceilings were painted with imitation frescoes of Roman decay, crumbling pillars, faded laurels, and skulls wearing crowns. Tall mirrors distorted reflections along the walls, while soft music played from a hidden gramophone. Candles flickered in candelabras fashioned from brass hands. And everywhere, the guests, men and women alike, moved in hushed conversation, all dressed in formal black and silver, all masked. A few wore feathers, one wore a veil. No one acknowledged us beyond a faint nod. "What is this place?" I murmured. "A salon of cultivated secrecy," Holmes replied. "A circle where power dabbles in death and art." The Vanitas movement, born of Dutch painting, celebrated mortality, time, and illusion. These people have made it a society. We wandered the room slowly. Holmes made no attempt at introductions, but observed everything, the way certain guests avoided the west side of the room, the odd symbol etched faintly onto a mirror's edge, and the absence of food or drink. It was not a party. It was a ceremony in stasis. On a side table rested a thick, leather-bound guest book, open to a fresh page. Holmes bent slightly and ran his gloved fingers along the edge. "Empty," he whispered. "No names offered tonight. Anonymity reigns." I turned toward a curtained archway where a pair of tall figures stood, motionless. Behind them lay another chamber, just visible in glimmers. Softer lighting, perhaps another stage for the evening's purpose. One of the guards glanced in our direction, but said nothing. It was then that I saw her. A woman in a mourning dress, jet-beaded veil, long satin gloves, drifting between the mirrors like a wraith. She held a folded program in one hand and paused only briefly before slipping it into a nearby urn. Holmes followed her movement with a glimmer of interest. "Did you see what she left?" he asked. We approached the urn discreetly. I reached inside and drew out the paper she had deposited. It was not a program, but a folded letter written in a looping hand. He was never to have come here. They warned him, but pride drowned sense. Now he sinks again, and this time there will be no witness. Burn this. Holmes pocketed it with the smoothness of a man used to collecting dangerous truths. Suddenly, the music ceased. A low chime sounded, once, then twice, and the guests began to drift toward the curtained archway like obedient moths. The guards parted without a word. Holmes pressed my arm. "We go." We followed the crowd into a smaller chamber. At its center stood a stage, more precisely, a dais covered in dark velvet. Upon it lay a glass coffin. Inside was a figure, motionless, dressed in evening wear, his face obscured by a black veil. Around the coffin, petals had been scattered, red and white, and a long ribbon tied the man's hands at the waist. I felt a chill slide down my spine. The host of the ceremony, a tall man in priestly robes with the gloved hands of the Vanitas seal, stepped forward and addressed the crowd in a voice that echoed without effort. "The guest has returned to silence," he said, "as all vanity must. But his name remains unspoken, and his soul is undisturbed. Let none interfere." Holmes leaned toward me, voice low. "This is no symbolic rite. This is a message. They're burying him again, in front of witnesses. This club is no mere diversion. It is a theater for making the inconvenient vanish." I swallowed, unable to pull my eyes from the figure in the coffin. "Is that Frey?" "I doubt it," Holmes said grimly, "but someone wants us to think it is." "This is a third act, Watson. A body in the canal, a man was strangled, and now a silent funeral staged for an audience that asks no questions. The ceremony ended without fanfare. The guests dispersed slowly, murmuring low Latin phrases I could not catch. Holmes and I made our way back to the vestibule in silence, masks in hand. Outside, the fog had thickened again, cloaking the streets. "I need to speak with Cranley," Holmes said as we climbed into a waiting cab. "There is a piece missing in this triad of lies, and I suspect it sits within his household." "You think he knows more than he's said?" "I think someone inside his home never expected Gilbert Frey to return, and someone else made certain he would not." As the cab wheels rolled back toward the gaslit avenues of the city, I realized that the mystery we pursued was not simply about a man who had died twice, but about the identities we bury while still living, and the price paid when they claw their way back up through the soil. By the following morning, the streets had shed their veils of mist, but the mystery remained cloaked as ever. Holmes had sent a telegram to Mr. Edgar Cranley shortly after dawn and received an immediate return, short and precise, requesting that Holmes visit the Cranley residence in Kensington by 9:30. We arrived promptly, greeted by a stony-faced housekeeper who led us past a vestibule of polished oak and into a private parlour that looked, to my eyes, less like a solicitor's home and more like a room arranged for mourning. There were black drapes on the west windows, vases of calla lilies, and a mantelpiece cleared of all but one object, a small framed photograph turned face down. Holmes crossed to it at once and examined the back. "Has someone died here recently, Mrs. Gray?" he asked without turning. The housekeeper, who had returned to hover near the door, stiffened. "That belonged to Miss Evelyn. She turned it down herself the morning Mr. Fry passed, sir. I've not dared touch it since Miss Evelyn being Mr. Cranley's wife," Holmes asked. "His late wife, sir," she corrected. "She passed nearly 2 years ago, cancer of the bone. A long sorrow." Holmes gave a thoughtful hum and turned the photograph over. It revealed a studio portrait of a woman in her 30s, solemn-faced and dark-eyed, wearing a strand of pearls and an expression of quiet endurance. "This was the only photo on display?" he asked. "The only one she allowed, sir," Mrs. Gray said softly. She didn't care for likenesses. At that moment, Cranley entered the parlour. He looked little changed from our previous meeting, though the circles beneath his eyes had deepened and his collar sat looser on his neck. He offered no greeting, only motioned toward the chairs. "You've returned sooner than expected, Mr. Holmes." "Because the living have an irritating habit of dying on new timetables," Holmes replied, taking a seat without invitation. "We've just returned from the Vanitas Club in Poplar. Are you familiar with it?" Cranley's jaw tightened. "I've heard of it. A circle for eccentric aristocrats with more time than sense." "A man was murdered yesterday," I said, "strangled with a red ribbon and left in Lambeth. He was wearing the same cravat you described on Fray Cranley's expression barely changed. Then I was mistaken in what I saw that morning. It must have been a look-alike. Your certainty is unconvincing," Holmes said coldly, "as is your reluctance to disclose what truly brought Mr. Fray into your home 2 weeks ago." Cranley hesitated, then rose and crossed to the fireplace. "Very well. But you must understand, Fray wasn't only a client. He was connected to Evelyn. They knew each other before I ever did. She once referred to him as a cousin, though I suspect it was not by blood. Was he her lover?" Holmes asked, without judgment or curiosity. "Only calculation." Cranley's hand gripped the mantel. "I don't know. I suspected as much once in the early days of our marriage. But then he disappeared abroad. He re-emerged only after she died. And when he reappeared," Holmes said softly, "he came not merely to visit, but to stay." Cranley nodded. "He said he had enemies. That he needed quiet, discretion, and a place to lie low for a week. I was still in mourning. Perhaps that made me foolish or forgiving. He brought with him a small trunk, a valise, and a set of papers he asked me to hold in confidence." Holmes leaned forward. "Are these papers still in your possession?" Cranley hesitated. "I burned them." Holmes stilled. "That was either an act of fear or guilt." "Both," Cranley said hoarsely. "There was something in those papers. Letters, drawings, receipts for purchases under other names. That suggested Fray was not Fray at all, or rather that he had become Fray by assuming the name. And perhaps others." I stared. "You believe he was an impostor?" "I believe he played Gilbert Fray, perhaps once with Evelyn's help, perhaps for something darker. All I know is that when I learned of his death and saw the signet ring on the body, I felt relief. I told myself whatever game they had played was over." Holmes rose now and walked slowly to the bookshelf. He examined the volumes, letting his fingers trail along their spines, pausing at a row of bound legal treatises. "Did your wife ever speak of the Vanitas Club?" he asked. Cranley's brow creased. Never. She disliked clubs of any kind." Holmes turned abruptly. And yet she wore mourning jewelry long before her own death, avoided photographs, and associated herself with a man who appears to have forged more than one identity. What are you implying? That your wife may have belonged to a circle where secrecy and identity were blurred, perhaps willingly. Cranley took a sharp breath. No. Evelyn was many things, but she was not. But Holmes had crossed to a side table and picked up a small carved box. He opened it and removed a black ribbon embroidered with fine red thread in the shape of a twisted blossom. The same stitching we found on the ribbon used in the Lambeth murder, Holmes murmured. Why would such a token remain in your home? Cranley stared at it, his face blanching. That was left in Evelyn's drawer. I never knew what it meant. Holmes slipped the ribbon into his coat pocket. It means that the Vanitas Club knew her, or that someone within it did. And now, one by one, they are unspooling a story none of them wishes to see retold. He turned to the solicitor. Tell me honestly, when you identified Frey's body in the canal, did you see the face clearly? Cranley was silent. It was water-swollen, he said finally, unrecognizable. I based my confirmation on the ring, then you may have buried a stranger, Holmes said. Or perhaps someone Frey meant to become. A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Gray returned, pale and flustered. Mr. Cranley, a letter just arrived. No stamp, hand-delivered. She passed the envelope to Cranley. He opened it slowly, then handed it to Holmes without a word. It read, The dead do not rise, but their masks remain. One more curtain must fall, tonight, at the Winter Conservatory. Below the text was a symbol, a withered blossom encircled by flame. Holmes handed the letter to me, already stepping toward the door. Watson, we are being invited not to solve a death, but to witness its next act. Cranley spoke behind us, his voice faint. If you go there tonight, Mr. Holmes, beware. The last person who tried to unmask them became the guest who died twice. The Winter Conservatory stood on the eastern edge of Regent's Park, behind wrought iron gates and half shrouded by twisted wisteria and the creeping ivy of disuse. Once a marvel of glass and iron, built to shelter rare orchids and subtropical ferns, it had, in recent years, fallen into quiet ruin. The great panes of its roof were fogged with mildew, and the garden paths were choked with moss. By day, it looked abandoned. By night, it seemed a cathedral built to honor secrets. We arrived just past 10, under a sky heavy with clouds but dry for now. Holmes was wrapped in a long grey cloak, collar turned up, and beneath it he carried a small roll of black cloth and a silver-tipped cane that concealed, I knew, more than a gentleman's posture. "You're expecting trouble," I said quietly as we passed through the gate. "I'm expecting masks," he replied, "and men who have worn them too long." A dim glow shone from the interior of the conservatory, and faint strains of chamber music drifted through the chill. As we stepped inside, a transformation awaited us. The neglected garden had been swept clean, and iron torches flanked the entrance. Within the grand glass chamber, candles flickered along rows of marble planters now cleared of any plants, and the air bore the dry perfume of something ancient. Camphor and incense, perhaps. At the center of the chamber stood a platform of dark wood, covered in black velvet. Rows of chairs surrounded it in a half-circle, already half filled with seated figures, some in evening attire, others in academic robes, all wearing the distinctive masks of the Vanitas Club. Their silence was profound. Each man and woman faced the platform as if awaiting a sermon or an execution. Holmes and I took seats at the back, careful to remain observers rather than participants. No one acknowledged us, though I noticed a slight tilt of one veiled head as we passed. A woman, perhaps, or a man, mimicking the softness of one. Moments later, a man in formal black robes ascended the platform. His mask was not the usual, satin half-veil, but a full porcelain design, white and expressionless, with a single teardrop painted beneath the left eye. Holmes whispered, "That, I suspect, is the curator." The curator lifted a gloved hand, and the music ceased. "Tonight," he began, voice smooth and distant, "we acknowledge the closing of a name. One who wore many titles and bore many debts. His death was necessary, and now it is confirmed. Let no member speak it, lest the act of silence be undone." The audience bowed their heads. The curator continued, "But silence is only one half of forgetting. To sever the thread entirely, the image must be removed." He turned and motioned to the back of the platform, where two masked attendants unveiled a tall object draped in dark cloth. They pulled the cloth away to reveal a portrait, life-sized, richly painted, and unmistakably of Gilbert Fry. Even beneath the brushstrokes I recognized the high cheekbones, the dark hair swept with oil, the distant gleam of self-possession in the eyes. The very man whose body now lay beneath Lambeth soil. Or so we believed. Holmes leaned forward. "It's not merely a funeral. It's an erasure. They're rewriting his existence." The curator lifted a long iron poker from beside the dais. With a deliberate motion, he stepped to the portrait and, in complete silence, drove the poker through the canvas. A collective breath drew in from the audience. The fabric split with a slow, tearing groan. Then something happened that no one expected. From the shadows behind the platform, a voice spoke. "That will not be necessary." A figure stepped forward, unmasked, alive. My heart lurched. It was Gilbert Fry, or a man bearing his exact likeness. Dressed in a dark coat, gloves in hand, face pale but composed. A single bruise marred his neck, just visible beneath his collar. His voice was calm, controlled, like a man giving testimony rather than protest. "Before you bury me again," he said, "I will speak." The curator froze. The poker dropped from his hand with a clang. Gasps echoed among the masked guests. A few rose from their seats. The illusion had fractured. Frey stepped onto the platform. "You intended to end me in the canal. When that failed, you staged a replacement, and when that too failed, you sent your ribbons to finish the work." He turned slowly. "But you forgot one thing. I never joined. I was your reflection, but never your shadow." A commotion began at the far end of the room. One of the masked guests had risen and was making for the exit. Holmes was quicker. He cut across the aisle and intercepted the figure with a sharp motion of his cane. The mask fell away. "Cranley," I breathed in astonishment. It was indeed Edgar Cranley, face contorted in panic, eyes wild. "You shouldn't be here," he spat at Frey. "You were meant to vanish." Frey looked at him without malice. "You wore my name more than I did. It was your scheme that drowned the man you hired to pretend to be me." Holmes stepped between them. "Let me complete the picture, gentlemen, before it tears entirely." He turned to the assembly, his voice carrying clearly and sharply. Gilbert Fry was a name worn by many. The original, this man, disappeared years ago. Cranley used his supposed reappearance to forge a legal identity for illicit funds, sheltering investments through foreign aliases. When Frey returned unexpectedly, Cranley panicked. He hired a man, one who resembled Frey, to impersonate him for one final appearance. That man became the body in the canal. And when the real Frey surfaced again, I added, Cranley arranged the Lambeth murder. Another switch, another body, another ribbon. Frey nodded. They would have buried me 3 times, each more permanent than the last. The guests began rising now, whispering among themselves. The spell was broken. The Vanitas Club, long a shadow society, had been pierced by light. Cranley was taken away without a struggle. As the crowd dispersed into the London night, I watched Holmes approach the torn portrait. He studied it with the same intensity he had given the photograph in Cranley's parlour. "A face borrowed," he murmured, "a death rehearsed, and a name too easy to erase." We left the conservatory in silence, save for one last question I asked as we passed through the gates. "Do you think Frey will survive this time?" Holmes looked back at the glass dome, now empty. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether he ever truly lived at all." The events at the Winter Conservatory left an impression on my mind like a lantern's glow upon a shuttered wall, unsettling, unfinished, and flickering with shadows that refused to settle into sense. We returned to Baker Street not long after midnight, weary yet alert, our thoughts racing ahead of our footsteps. Holmes shed his cloak the moment we stepped inside. He lit the fire with an almost impatient gesture and seated himself in the armchair without a word. I poured us both brandy from the decanter and handed him a glass, which he accepted absently, swirling the contents without drinking. "Gilbert Fry lives," I said aloud, as if the statement might somehow anchor reality. Holmes nodded, but the movement was restrained. "Lives, yes. But he remains a man without a fixed point in time. We have witnessed a return, not a resurrection, and there is a difference. You believe he was never meant to exist?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that Gilbert Fry is a fabrication, an identity woven and rewoven by those who needed him. Cranley merely tried to wear it longer than he was allowed." I frowned. But Frey stood there on that platform, very much real, very much self-aware. Holmes gave a thin smile. "So are actors. So are liars. So are ghosts." He rose and moved to the desk, where the mourning ribbon with its red embroidery lay beside the torn telegram from Poplar and the scorched fragment of the forged letter from Frey's belongings. Each relic seemed harmless on its own, paper, silk, wax, but together they traced the map of a life no one fully inhabited. "What remains unclear," I said, "is the second man, the one found strangled in Lambeth. If he was meant to impersonate Frey, who was he? Why take that risk?" Holmes tapped the cane he had used earlier, its silver tip now faintly smudged with powder from the warehouse floor. "Because some masks are purchased, Watson, and others are inherited." We sat in silence for several minutes. Then Holmes spoke again, quietly. "Tomorrow I must speak to Fry. Alone. No more public stages. No more rituals. Do you trust him?" "I trust no one in a play where the program has no author." The following morning, Holmes sent a note via messenger to the address Frey had scrawled on the back of a wine list just before leaving the conservatory, a discreet hotel off Aldwych, known for its discretion and its clientele of wandering diplomats. The reply was swift and courteous. Frey would receive Holmes at 11. I accompanied Holmes as far as the hotel's steps, but he insisted on entering alone. "If there is danger," he said dryly, "it will already be seated with its legs crossed and a drink in hand." He returned some 50 minutes later, face unreadable beneath his hat brim. I did not ask what passed between them, not at first. Only when we had returned to Baker Street did Holmes speak, as he peeled off his gloves and gazed out the window into the street below. "He is not the man Cranley thought he was," he said, "but neither is he a liar in the traditional sense. He is something older than that, a man who has worn too many names to be loyal to any." I poured him tea, saying nothing. "He claims he was born in Alexandria, raised in Lisbon, and educated in Lyon. He spent years in Marseille and Istanbul trading in rare texts, and that one day, in a gathering not unlike the Vanitas Club, he was offered the chance to become someone with papers, wealth, access. Gilbert Fry." I leaned forward. "And he accepted?" "He did, but on the condition that it was temporary. A mask," he said, "to be worn until the real Frey returned or was forgotten altogether. He was to keep the name clean, the connections warm, and vanish when the curtain dropped. And yet," I said, "he stayed." Holmes nodded. "He fell in love, Watson, with Evelyn Cranley. She knew what he was, perhaps even admired it. They were alike in that, mirror souls in borrowed clothing, and then she died. And he lost his anchor." We sat in silence again, the clock ticking with sudden prominence. Outside, carriages rumbled past in the autumn chill. I could see Holmes's mind spinning further still, towards something yet unsaid. "There is more," I prompted gently. Holmes tapped his fingers on the edge of the table. "Frey showed me a ledger. hidden within his trunk. It listed names, not accounts, identities. Dozens, each with dates and places attached. Men who existed on paper and nowhere else. All tied to legal firms, shipping agents, and charitable foundations. The kind of shell lives that can purchase land, fund expeditions, or vanish without consequence. I felt my stomach tighten. And Cranley? Not just a user of the system. A creator. He helped fabricate many of those lives, use them to move funds through colonies, cover debts, and launder fortunes. And Gilbert Fry, the real one, was a keystone. A stable identity wrapped in enough mystery to wear any past until he returned, I murmured. Precisely. And suddenly, he was not a ghost, but a man with memories, desires, grievances. That made him dangerous. I sat back, overwhelmed by the scale of what Holmes described. So what now? Does Frey vanish again? Holmes looked toward the fire. He asked me if he should. And what did you say? I told him that men who live between masks must one day choose their face, or lose all of them. He paused. He wept, Watson. Not for Evelyn or for the men who died in his name, but for the child he never held that struck me deeply. There was a child? A letter in Evelyn's drawer, never posted, addressed to a daughter placed in care abroad, likely born in secrecy to avoid scandal. Frey believes she's alive. Perhaps the only true thing left of him. I rose and stood at the window, absorbing the full sorrow of it. So much artifice, I said, so much deception. And in the end, it was never about money or power. Just being known. Holmes stood beside me. And therein lies the tragedy. In their world, Watson, it is safer to die than to be seen. Outside, London breathed as it always had, oblivious, impersonal, endless. But somewhere within it, a man with no past walked forward into the fog, uncertain whether he was returning to life or stepping into one more borrowed shadow. It was on the third morning following the incident at the Winter Conservatory that the last, most unusual parcel arrived at Baker Street. A modest, brown-wrapped bundle, no larger than a folio, tied with black cord and sealed with an acacia blossom stamped in red wax. Holmes turned it over on the table with the tip of his penknife, his expression unreadable. A curious choice of seal, he murmured. The Vanitas Club does not send its couriers so openly, unless it means to appear theatrical. He sliced through the string with care, peeled back the paper, and revealed an object far stranger than I had anticipated. A cloth-bound ledger, its cover hand-tooled with the same flower motif. Inside, the pages had been organized with disturbing precision. Each entry recorded a name, a false origin, a date of assumed identity, and a trailing list of silent associations. Shipping lines, fund transfers, property deeds, charitable endowments, no personal notes, no fingerprints of affection, just identities used like gloves. Good God, I whispered. There must be hundreds. Holmes nodded slowly. This is the full extent of the identity web, more exhaustive than even Fry suggested. Whoever compiled this did so not only to preserve it, but to remember who had become what. And when he turned the pages quickly until a familiar name appeared halfway down the spine. Frey Gilbert, assumed 1897, origin assigned, Geneva via Lisbon. Initial architect, E.C. Cranley. Use suspended, 1901, reinstated under approval, 1903 inheritance document, Vanitas Ledger number. 6 burial instructions. None confirmed. Holmes traced the lines with his fingertip. He was meant to remain useful, Watson, not permanent. The moment he attached meaning to the name, he broke the illusion. That made him a liability. A loose sheet fell from the inside cover. Holmes caught it before it touched the ground. It was written in a familiar hand, tight, looping, impatient. You cannot kill what was never born. But you may, if careful, invite it to rest. This is my closing gift, Holmes. Burn it if you choose. But remember, some names die loudly, others disappear so quietly that only the dead notice. GFI stared at the signature. He sent this, or someone who wishes us to believe so, but the implication is clear. He's gone again, voluntarily. The ledger is his reckoning, his last will. Holmes folded the letter and placed it atop the parcel. Then, in a moment of unusual quiet, he stood and walked to the hearth. He stared into the fire for some time. "I have encountered murderers who showed more remorse than this," he said softly. "But I do not believe Frey was a murderer. He was a mirror, held up to too many men, and cracked by what he reflected. I did not respond." There was a stillness between us now, not of comfort, but of weight, the way air stills before a thunderclap. A knock at the door interrupted our reverie. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a calling card between two fingers as if it might explode. "It's a woman, Mr. Holmes. Young. Says she's been referred to you by a name she didn't wish to say aloud." Holmes took the card. His eyes flicked over it. "Miss Laurent." He nodded. "Send her in." The woman who entered could not have been more than 20. Her coat was finely tailored, her gloves plain, and her bearing unmistakably continental. There was something of the Lycée in her posture, and something of secrecy in her silence. Her dark hair was tucked into a small black hat, and her eyes scanned the room like someone not used to safety. "You are Mr. Holmes?" she asked in softly accented English. "I am." She sat only when gestured to and placed a folded paper on the table between them. "I believe someone left this for me to find," she said. "At a school in Dieppe, in a locked drawer, I was told belonged to my former guardian. Holmes unfolded the note. I rose and stood behind him to read over his shoulder. To A. Laurent. Should you ever wish to know who you are not, go to Baker Street. He will know. He always does. G. The girl looked at us both with wary confusion. I do not know this man, and yet I found this, as if waiting. Holmes regarded her carefully. You are not French? No, I was born in Malta and raised in Lille, or so I was told. My records were destroyed in a fire. I've always known something was missing. He glanced at me. Watson, recall the letter Evelyn left behind. The daughter was placed abroad. Hidden for protection, I felt the chill before I acknowledged it. She's the child. Holmes nodded. The one thing Fry could not fake. The one person he could not abandon without some echo. He returned his gaze to Miss Law. What do you want to know? She hesitated. Only this. Was he a good man? Holmes was silent for a time. Then, he was a real man, Miss Laurent. Even when nothing else around him was, she seemed to absorb that more than hear it, as if it were something she had long suspected but needed naming aloud. She rose, gave a small nod, and turned toward the door. As she reached it, Holmes called softly, You may find other doors closed to you now. Others watching. If they do, let me know. She did not look back. I think they already are. When the door closed, Holmes sat once more and stared at the fire. Well, he said at last, now we know what lingers after the mask falls. I crossed the room, picked up the ledger, and held it a moment longer before setting it into the flames. We watched in silence as it burned, names, lives, secrets, all reduced to ash. And with them, perhaps, the last traces of Gilbert Fry, the man who died twice, and lived just long enough to leave something behind that could not be faked. The ledger was gone, its spine curled, its names devoured by flame. And yet the room did not feel lighter. If anything, the air seemed more burdened. We had watched the final proof of a dozen lives vanish into smoke, but guilt, like certain perfumes, lingers long after its bottle is shattered. Holmes sat unmoving by the hearth for nearly an hour after the last ember had dimmed. He didn't smoke, didn't speak. Only the quiet tapping of his fingertips against the arm of his chair betrayed the furious workings of his mind. What troubles you? I asked at last. He turned his head slowly, like a man waking from a trance. Something does not align, Watson. Not with Frey's disappearance, nor with Miss Laurent's appearance. You believe she isn't his daughter? Oh, I believe she is. or at least that she believes it. But what I cannot accept is the timing. The ledger appears, the note is discovered, the daughter arrives. All within the span of 48 hours. You think someone orchestrated it? I think someone wanted the curtain drawn. I stood and fetched another log for the fire, letting the silence deepen while Holmes wrestled with whatever chord of the puzzle had not yet resolved in his mind. But even I could feel the story had not truly concluded. Miss Laurent had asked if Frey was a good man, and though Holmes had answered with his usual precision, he had done so too quickly, too cleanly. And when Holmes answered cleanly, I had learned to worry. By the following afternoon, he had snapped back into motion. Letters flew from his desk in all directions, one to the Office of Shipping Registries in Bordeaux, another to a contact in the Portuguese consulate, and a third to a private investigator in Geneva. Within hours, telegrams began to arrive in reply, one after the other like footfalls in an empty hall. The last came in just after nightfall. Holmes read it, folded it twice, and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he reached for his walking stick and turned to me with the look I'd come to associate with the breaking of locks. On doors or in minds. We're going to Chelsea, Watson. Whose house? Miss Laurent's. But she's only just arrived in London. Which makes the presence of a bodyguard outside her building rather curious, don't you think? The house in Chelsea was modest, recently let, and tucked between two grander Georgian properties that loomed over it like disapproving relatives. As Holmes predicted, a man stood across the street, smoking and watching the entryway with the rigid posture of one who knew how to hide his tension. We passed without acknowledging him and rapped lightly on the door. Miss Laurent answered herself. She wore a dark blue blouse, plain but well-tailored, and her hair was pinned up in a style that suggested she had not yet unpacked her past. She seemed surprised to see us, but not alarmed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please come in." The front room was simple, furnished in the sparse elegance of someone who had spent years in temporary lodgings. Books on a single shelf, a travel trunk beneath the window, and a kettle warming on the stove. Holmes did not sit. He stood near the fire and observed her with gentle gravity. "Miss Laurent, you spoke of guardians, of records lost in a fire. But your school in Dieppe was intact until last year, and no fire was reported. The drawer in which you found Frey's note was unlocked, and the person who directed you to it was a man described by school staff as wearing gloves and quoting Latin phrases about forgetting." Her face didn't change. Holmes pressed on. "That man belongs to the Vanitas Club, the same club that tried to bury Frey's identity, and yet they led you to him." She looked down, fingers tightening in her lap. "I don't understand what you want. I want the truth, not the version you were given." She looked up slowly. "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're being used," Holmes said softly. "Or worse, protected by those who have reason to keep you close." I stepped in. "Forgive the bluntness, Miss Laurent, but we need to know why they led you to us. Why now? Why make your existence known when they've spent so long silencing every thread of Frey's life?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because I asked them to." Holmes stiffened. She continued, "I have known for several years that the name I was given was false, that my records were false. I asked questions, too many. I followed them eventually to a man in Paris. He wore the same mask you described. He told me only this: when you are ready to stop pretending you were born in silence, go to Baker Street." "And the ledger?" Holmes asked. "I never saw it." "I was told it would find you if I did." Holmes' expression darkened. "Then someone wanted this chapter closed, but not burned." "Not yet. Why?" I asked. He turned toward me. "Because there's another name missing from the ashes, Watson. One I had overlooked." He crossed the room to the travel trunk and, without waiting for permission, flipped open the lid. Inside were a few folded garments, a passport, and at the bottom, a flat, wrapped frame. He drew it out and turned it over. It was a photograph, aged but vivid, of a younger Frey seated beside Evelyn Cranley on a garden bench. But between them, on a tartan blanket, was a child, a little girl, Miss Laurent. Holmes studied the frame. "Did you know him?" he asked. She nodded. "When I was small. I remember he smelled like tobacco and books." "Then why did you pretend not to?" "Because they told me that to know him was dangerous. That to remember him would undo everything." Holmes sighed. "Which means he's not gone." "Not yet. They wanted you to come forward now because something is coming, something he can't stop. But perhaps you can distract." She looked frightened now. "What am I meant to do?" Holmes stared into the fire. "You're meant to survive, Miss Laurent. And surviving, in their world, is the only kind of rebellion that counts." As we left the house, the man across the street lowered his gaze. Holmes didn't acknowledge him, only muttered, "Not yet then. They're still watching." And beneath his coat, I saw his hand tighten, not in fear, but readiness. For several days after our visit to Miss Laurent in Chelsea, Baker Street returned to a semblance of stillness, though not peace. The wind howled against the windows with increasing insistence. The chimneys rattled like bones, and the city itself seemed to draw inward with the season's approach. Holmes spent most of his time in the chair by the hearth, not idle, but listening to the city's movements, to the silence between telegrams, to the sound, he said, of a curtain refusing to fall. I found him one morning, not asleep, but statuesque, staring at the scorched corner of the fireplace where the ledger had burned. The teacup on the table beside him remained untouched, its contents long gone cold. "You haven't eaten," I said gently, setting a plate of buttered toast on the edge of the table. "I have no appetite," he muttered, "nor inclination." "The case is not yet done, Watson. We are merely standing in the intermission between acts. You think they'll make another move?" "I think they already have," he replied, standing suddenly. "I've been waiting for it to arrive." And arrive it did, just before noon. A package, once again anonymous, once again sealed in red wax. But this time the wax bore a new imprint, a fractured mirror. Holmes opened it with the careful fingers of a man disarming a trap. Inside was a velvet-wrapped object, stiff and rectangular. "A canvas," he said. He laid it on the table and peeled back the cloth. It was a painting, a portrait, yes, but not of Frey. It depicted a young woman with dark hair, seated before a mirror, her face turned slightly in profile. But the mirror showed not her face, but another's, a man's, watching her. Behind the mirror, a curtain had been painted half-drawn, revealing a second woman with her hand outstretched, as though about to pull the curtain fully aside. Holmes studied it in silence. "Symbolism," he said finally. "The Vanitas Club's true language. Every stroke is a message." He tapped the canvas. This is the real warning. The girl at the front is Miss Laurent. The mirror is her memory. The face watching her. Phrase. And behind the curtain. Another version of herself, I asked. Holmes shook his head. No. Someone else. Someone who shares the shape but not the soul. He turned and began pacing. There is something deeper here, Watson. Something we have misread. They didn't just want Frey gone. They wanted him unmade, erased from memory, but not because he threatened them with exposure. Number. Because he remembered something they've worked too hard to forget. I frowned. The ledger didn't name any specific threat. Just aliases, timelines, financial links. Holmes paused. Because the truth wasn't written in that ledger. It was painted. He snapped his fingers, crossed to the bookshelf, and pulled down a catalogue of art auction records. He turned pages quickly, finally stopping on a listing from 6 years prior. Here, he said, showing me an entry titled The Lacuna Collection. Portraits from the Quiet Circle. The Quiet Circle? I asked. A precursor to the Vanitas Club, Holmes replied. Smaller, more selective. Artists, primarily. Patrons of the symbolic. They believed secrets could be concealed within aesthetics, coded into brushwork, into the positioning of hands, gazes, frames. He pointed to one painting in the entry. Portrait of the Watcher. Artist, unknown, sold anonymously. The image, beside the description, showed a rough sketch of a canvas nearly identical in composition to the one we'd just unwrapped. But that can't be. It can, Holmes interrupted. And it is. They've begun recirculating the paintings they once hid, not to preserve their legacy, but to signal its closure. He stepped back from the table and crossed his arms. Watson, they're ending the circle. Quietly. And permanently I felt a chill. And Miss Laurent is the last loose thread. He nodded. Which means we must reach her before the next portrait is painted. Miss Laurent received us again at twilight. Her windows were drawn and the lamps dim. She did not seem surprised to see us. I felt something would happen, she said softly. I dreamt last night of a hallway of mirrors. But in every one, I was someone else. Holmes laid the painting on her parlor table. She didn't react at first, just stared. Then she reached out and touched the figure behind the curtain. This, she whispered, this is the woman who used to visit the school. She came only once a year. She never spoke, but she'd leave a book in my drawer, always fiction. But once, it was a journal. What journal? Holmes asked. I hid it, in the floorboards of my dormitory. I was too afraid to keep it with me. But I remember one phrase. It was written in Latin on the last page, ad veritatem per speculum. Through the mirror, the truth Holmes inhaled sharply. That phrase was etched on the frame of the portrait that was pierced at the conservatory. A motto, the club's core doctrine. He turned to her. Miss Laurent, what if your mother wasn't merely involved with Frey, but with the circle itself? What if she, not Frey, held the secret they now seek to extinguish? Miss Laurent paled. But she died. I saw her grave. Indeed, Holmes said. But was she buried as Evelyn Cranley? The question lingered in the room like smoke. Holmes began to pace. If the Vanitas Circle truly believed in transformation through identity, then Evelyn could have been both patron and architect. A woman who curated lives, forged truths, and, when the time came, vanished into her own mirror. He turned to her. You are not merely her daughter. You are her last witness. Miss Laurent looked at the painting again. She knew they would come for me. Holmes nodded. But she left clues. Paintings, journals, notes. Each one was a thread in the tapestry they tried to unweave. He straightened. We will go to the school in Dieppe, he said. Tonight. The journal may still be there, or the room may reveal what was left behind. I frowned. That's across the channel. Surely we'll need time to prepare. Holmes shook his head. There is no time. Not anymore. When the portraits begin to reappear, it is because the fire has already been lit. Miss Laurent stood without hesitation. Then let's find what she left. As we stepped out into the street, Holmes glanced once over his shoulder at the painted figure behind the curtain. She isn't watching, he said softly. She's waiting. It was a bitter wind that swept across the channel that night, tearing through the decks of the midnight steamer like a warning. We stood at the rail in silence, Miss Laurent wrapped in a long coat and scarf, Holmes hunched inward beneath his Inverness, his gaze fixed not on the dark sea, but on the void beyond it. You've gone quiet, I said. Holmes didn't look at me. I've been quiet since we burned the ledger, Watson. Some fires reveal, others obscure. We arrived in Dieppe shortly before dawn, the sky just beginning to bleed grey across the horizon. A hired carriage took us through the sleeping town to the outskirts, where the École Sainte-Véronique, Miss Laurent's former boarding school, sat half forgotten on a wooded rise. The main gates were chained, but the side path remained passable, overgrown with wet vines and moss-covered stones. Miss Laurent led us with the certainty of memory, not hesitation. As the first pale light filtered through the cloud-streaked sky, we reached the rear wing of the school, a dormitory she had not seen in over a decade. The windows were dust-blind and shuttered, but the door creaked open at her push. Inside, the scent of old chalk and mildew clung to the air, and the floorboards groaned like tired bones beneath our steps. "This was my room," she said, pausing at the fourth door on the left. "Here." Holmes stepped inside first, examining the empty bed frame, the flaking plaster walls, the crooked iron sconce still hanging near the wardrobe. But his attention turned immediately to the floor. He crouched, feeling along the edge of a warped board near the far wall. "Here," he murmured. With a penknife, he pried it upward. Within the hollow space lay a slim, leather-bound volume, wrapped in linen and tied with a blue ribbon. Miss Laurent knelt beside him as he drew it out. She didn't touch it, only stared, as if half expecting it to vanish. Holmes undid the ribbon and opened to the first page. There was no title, no name, only a date, February 1900. And beneath it, in Evelyn's unmistakable hand, "This is not for the circle. This is for what they buried beneath it." Holmes turned the pages slowly. Some contained drawings, rough sketches of faces and figures, always in profile, always looking into mirrors or through curtains. Others were written passages, fragments of thought captured like pressed flowers. They don't fear discovery. They fear remembrance. A mask that fits too well becomes a second face. He thinks I am guiding him. He does not see that I am guiding them. Then, near the end, Holmes found what he sought. "The child will not be raised as mine." That name is poisoned now. I have placed her where even memory cannot follow. If she survives long, enough to ask, tell her the mirror was never about truth. It was about seeing who continued to look. He looked up slowly at Miss Laurent. "She hid you, yes. But not to protect herself. To protect you from what she once was," I asked. "So Evelyn was part of the circle." "She was more than part of it," Holmes said quietly. "She constructed it. The painter's muse, the archivist's patron, the forger of new beginnings. But something changed." He turned one final page and froze. On the last sheet was a charcoal sketch, rushed but unmistakably evocative. It depicted a child holding the hand of a masked woman, but beside them, barely visible, was the outline of a man with a cane, observing from a distance. The features were not drawn, but the profile, the posture, it was Holmes. I stepped closer, heart thudding. "That's impossible." Holmes closed the journal. "Not impossible. Intended. Evelyn knew we would come. Not because of who we are, but because of what must always follow a circle, a line, a boundary, an end." Miss Laurent looked down at the sketch, then at us. "Do you understand what this means?" she whispered. "She left this for you." Holmes gave a faint nod. "And in doing so, she forced the circle's hand. They must act now. If they do nothing, they admit this truth. If they act, they expose themselves." He turned to me. "We must return to London." Immediately, by late afternoon, we were back in Baker Street. A telegram awaited us, slipped beneath the door. Holmes read it and passed it to me without comment. From Lestrade. "Body discovered in Soho studio. Male. Single stab wound. No ID, but a note pinned to the chest. The mirror is broken." Miss Laurent sat in the armchair beside the fire, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Who was it?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "It was the man who watched your door in Chelsea." A final loose thread. He turned to the mantel and pressed his palm against the cool marble, then looked back at her. "You're no longer being watched, Miss Laurent. But that is not the same as being safe." She nodded, her face pale, but steady. "I don't want to run." "You won't," Holmes said, But you must choose now whether you remain a question they fear, or become an answer they cannot silence." There was a pause. Then she stood. "I will tell my story," she said. "Everything I know, everything I remember." Holmes gave her a rare smile. Not warm, but respectful. "Then the curtain has truly risen. And this time there will be no concealment." That night, as London slept, I found Holmes once more at the window, pipe in hand, gaze fixed upon the fogged glass. "They'll come for her again, won't they?" I asked. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but they'll find no masks waiting. Only mirrors." He tapped the pipe lightly. "And sometimes, Watson, that's the better defense." In the week that followed Miss Laurent's declaration, London changed. Not in any way the average citizen might notice. There were no headlines, no arrests, no confessions whispered in fog-bound alleyways. And yet Holmes and I both felt the shift. It was in the silence of the newspapers, where the art auctions column ran curiously blank. It was in the absence of invitations to galleries we had not known we were always being invited to. It was in the feeling that certain doors, ones we'd never seen, but had always been watched behind, were quietly closing. Miss Laurent remained at a hotel on Jermyn Street under an assumed name, but not one of her own choosing. Holmes arranged it himself. "A name no longer in circulation," he said with a dry smile. "Irony, after all, is a currency they still respect." She was not idle. Each afternoon she visited the reading room at the British Museum, reviewing art catalogues, auction records, and exhibition pamphlets that stretched back decades. She had begun sketching again too, quick, tight renderings in charcoal, mostly of mirrors and drapery, always from unusual angles. "She's hunting them," Holmes remarked one morning, watching her from the upper balcony. "Not with accusation, but with precision. That will unsettle them more than any courtroom ever could." We had no further contact from the Vanitas circle, not directly. But Holmes received a brief, unsigned letter delivered by hand and sealed in plain black wax. It bore only one line: "The portrait has been claimed. The collection is dissolved. There will be no further exhibition." Holmes folded the paper and dropped it into the fire without a word. "Do you believe them?" I asked. He watched the edges curl. "No, but I believe they believe it's done." 3 days later, we were visited by a man I had never seen before, and whom Holmes introduced only as Mr. Tell, a name that smelled of fiction. He wore a dark suit, carried a briefcase with polished brass buckles, and refused tea. His accent was faintly Central European, his manner clipped, and his message direct. He had come with a sealed envelope addressed to Holmes and a request. "She will be left alone," he said. "That is agreed." But only if the final piece is returned. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "The journal?" "No." The portrait. Holmes studied him. "There are several." Mr. Tell gave a faint, almost rueful smile. "There is only one that matters. The one she carries in her mind." He rose. "We are not savages, Mr. Holmes. We only remove what must not echo." "And what if it's already begun to echo?" Holmes asked. Mr. Tell paused at the door. "Then we hope the walls are thick enough." He left without another word. Inside the envelope he had delivered was a photograph, one we had never seen before. It showed Evelyn Cranley in profile, seated at an easel, painting. Behind her, a young Gilbert Frey leaned against the wall, watching. But what caught Holmes's attention was the canvas she was working on. Though the image was small, blurred by time and light, Holmes recognized the composition instantly. It was the painting we'd seen sent to Miss Laurent, the third portrait. "She painted it," I said. "She knew." Holmes nodded. "And she planned." He sat for a long time, fingers laced. "Watson," he said at last, "there's something that's troubled me since the beginning." "Only one thing?" I offered. He gave me a glance of mock exasperation, then grew serious again. "The phrase from Evelyn's journal. The mirror was never about truth." It was about seeing who continued to look. I took it to mean memory, surveillance, but I believe now it was something else entirely. He rose, crossed to the bookshelf, and removed a slim volume of Eastern philosophies. He flipped to a dog-eared page and read aloud, "To see the reflection of another is to see the distance between selves. But to become the reflection is to vanish entirely." I frowned. "A riddle. A design," Holmes said. "The circle did not just deal in secret identities. They manufactured distance. Between father and child, between patron and artist, between victim and witness. They ensured their members could never be traced, not just through records, but through recognition. Which is why they feared Frey." Holmes nodded, because he remembered. Not data, not ledgers. Faces. Feelings. He could look at a painting and name the hand that painted it. He could look at a girl and know the woman who had once carried her. That kind of knowing. That's what they sought to burn. Miss Laurent returned that evening from the museum with an envelope in her gloved hand. "They had this in their archives," she said quietly. "It was never checked out. No catalogue number, but it was there, filed under obscura, untitled correspondence." Holmes opened it. Inside were 4 folded sheets, yellowing with age. They were letters. From Evelyn, not to Frey, not to the circle, but to her daughter. "You were never meant to live in a mirror. You were meant to break it. They will tell you I vanished. I did, but not from you. The last face I ever painted was yours. I gave it to a friend. He promised to keep it safe. If you ever find a painting of a girl staring into a dark pool, look carefully. You're not alone in that reflection." Holmes leaned back, eyes closed. "So it survives," Miss Laurent whispered. "You mean the painting?" "No, the promise." He handed the letters back to her. "You don't need our protection anymore." She nodded slowly, folded the papers, and placed them in her coat. As she left Baker Street that final time, Holmes did not rise. He only watched her from the window, pipe unlit, eyes narrowed. "She walks like Evelyn," he said softly. "But she looks over her shoulder less." "And what of the circle?" I asked. "Do you believe it's truly gone?" Holmes took a long breath. "No, but it is fading. They built a temple of secrecy, and like all temples, it eventually became a ruin. And ruins, Watson, are where truths tend to grow." He turned back to the fire. "I once said that the guest died twice," he murmured. "But perhaps I was wrong." "How so?" He gave a tired smile. "Perhaps he never died at all. Perhaps he just became someone worth remembering."